There's a saying in Hollywood, never mistake silence for weakness. Chuck Norris had heard every boast, deflected every challenge, and walked away from more fights than most men ever stepped into. He didn't need to prove anything. Not anymore. But on a humid afternoon in Los Angeles, when Steven Seagal strutted into a charity dojo with cameras rolling and ego blazing, something shifted in the air. What started as an uninvited demonstration became a test of patience that even Chuck Norris struggled to maintain. Because there's only so much disrespect a legend can absorb before the line gets crossed. And when that line finally shattered, when Seagal pushed just one insult too far, the consequences weren't just brutal. They were inevitable. This is the story of what happens when arrogance meets authenticity, when Hollywood pretense collides with genuine power, and when a man who built his reputation on humility is forced to remind the world why respect was never optional. The morning had started peacefully enough. Chuck Norris stood in the center of his private training facility in the San Fernando Valley, watching a group of underprivileged kids execute their cot with focused determination. Sunlight filtered to the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The rhythmic sound of bare feet pivoting, the sharp exhale of controlled breath, the quiet intensity of young people learning discipline. These are the sounds that brought Chuck peace. After decades of film sets and tournament rings, of cameras and crowds and manufactured drama, this simple teaching had become his sanctuary. He moved among the students with gentle corrections, adjusting a stance here, demonstrating a hand position there. At 73 years old, his movements still carried the fluid precision that had made him a champion 6 times over. But it wasn't the tournaments he thought about anymore. It wasn't the movie roles or the fame or the reputation that had somehow transformed him into a cultural phenomenon beyond anything he'd intended. What mattered now were these kids, foster children, kids from broken homes, teenagers who found structure and purpose in the discipline of martial arts. Remember, he said quietly to a girl struggling with her balance, power doesn't come from anger. It comes from center, from knowing who you are. She nodded, tried again, and this time her technique was flawless. Chuck smiled. These were the moments that felt real. His assistant, Maria, appeared at the edge of the training floor, her expression apologetic. Chuck, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here. Says he wants to make a donation to program. Chuck glanced at the clock. They had another 40 minutes of training scheduled. Can it wait? He's persistent, and he brought a film crew. Something tightened in Chuck's chest, a familiar warning that he'd learned to trust over the years. A donation was always welcome, but film crews meant publicity, and publicity often came with agendas that had nothing to do with helping kids. Still, he couldn't turn away potential support for the program. These classes ran on donations, on his own money, and on the generosity of people who believed in giving children a second chance. Tell him to wait in the office, Chuck said. We'll finish the class first. Maria nodded and disappeared. Chuck turned back to his students, determined to give them the full attention they deserved. But something in the air had changed. He could feel it the way a weathered sailor feels a shift before a storm. When the class finally ended and the children had bowed and filed out, chattering excitedly about next week's lesson, Chuck made his way to the small office at the back of the facility. He could hear the voice before he even opened the door, loud, confident, commanding attention in that particular Hollywood way that always made Chuck slightly uncomfortable. Steven Seagal stood in the center of the modest room, overwhelming it with his presence. Tall, dressed entirely in black with his signature ponytail and beaded necklace, he radiated the kind of studied intensity that came from years of cultivating an image. Behind him, a cameraman adjusted his equipment, while a young woman with a clipboard hovered nearby, checking her phone. Chucknorris, Seagal announced, as if introducing a contestant on a game show. The legend himself. Chuck extended his hand, keeping his expression neutral. Steven, this is unexpected. Seagal's handshake was aggressive, performative, the kind designed to establish dominance. Chuck had felt 1,000 handshakes like it. Young fighters trying to prove something, actors playing roles off camera, men who confuse strength with the appearance of strength. I was in the neighborhood, Seagal said, releasing Chuck's hand and gesturing broadly. Heard about your little charity program here. Thought I'd stop by, maybe make a contribution, show some support. He glanced at the camera with a practiced smile. We're filming a documentary about real martial artists giving back to the community. The emphasis on real wasn't subtle. Chuck felt that tightening in his chest again, but he maintained his composure. That's generous of you. The kids can use all the help they can get. Of course, Seagal continued, already moving around the office as if he owned it, picking up photos from Chuck's tournament days, examining certificates on the wall. You know, Chuck, I've always respected what you've done. The movies, the tournament career. Very impressive for traditional martial arts. There was again that casual diminishment wrapped in apparent compliment. Traditional martial arts, as if what Chuck had spent his lifetime mastering was somehow quaint, outdated, insufficient compared to whatever Seagal considered modern or real. Chuck said nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful response. But I've been thinking, Seagal went on, turned to face Chuck with that calculated intensity. These kids you're teaching, they're learning what? Point sparring? Forms? That's great for discipline. Don't get me wrong. But in a real situation on the street, they need practical skills. Reality-based training. He tapped his chest. That's my specialty, you know. Aikido real combat systems. I've worked with law enforcement, military units. I could probably show them some things that would actually help them defend themselves. The cameraman was recording all of this. Chuck noticed. The whole setup suddenly became clear. This wasn't about making a donation. This was about Seagal positioning himself as the authority, the modern expert coming to improve upon Chuck's old-fashioned methods. It was about creating content, manufacturing a moment where Seagal could demonstrate his superiority. Chuck took a slow breath. He thought about the girl who'd finally found her balance, about the boy who'd been in 3 foster homes, and finally discovered something he could succeed at, about the teenager who'd stopped getting into fights at school, because he'd learned that real strength didn't need to be proven. These children didn't need aggressive combat systems. They needed confidence, discipline, respect for themselves and others. I appreciate the offer, Chuck said quietly, but the program is working well as it is. Seagal's expression shifted slightly, a flash of something that might have been irritation quickly masked by magnanimous understanding. Hey, I get it. You've been doing this your way for a long time. Hard to accept that maybe there are more effective approaches. He smiled at the camera. No offense, Chuck. You're a legend, but legends are usually built on what worked in the past, you know? Maria appeared in the doorway, her eyes worried. She clearly overheard at least part of the conversation. Chuck, the next group of students will be here in 20 minutes. Perfect timing. Seagal interjected before Chuck could respond. Maybe I could stay for that class? Demonstrate a few techniques? I'm sure the kids would benefit from seeing how real-world self-defense differs from traditional methods. He was already moving toward the door, assuming agreement. We'll get some great footage of the old guard and the new working together. Very inspirational. Chuck remained where he was, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge that anyone who knew him would recognize as a warning. Stephen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This isn't a photo opportunity or content for your documentary. These are vulnerable kids who need stability and consistency, not a demonstration. Seagal turned back, and for the first time, his cultivated charm slipped slightly. Come on, Chuck. Don't be territorial. I'm trying to help here. Unless, he paused, a calculated smile returning. Unless you're worried about the comparison? I mean, I understand. You've built your reputation on controlled tournament fighting and choreographed movie stunts. When someone who's actually used these techniques in real situations offers to share knowledge, that can feel threatening. The room went silent. Maria's eyes widened. Even the cameraman seemed to sense he was recording something that had gone beyond scripted documentary moments into genuine confrontation. Chuck felt a familiar stillness settle over him, the same calm that had always preceded action in his competition days. But this wasn't a competition. This was something uglier, a manufactured conflict designed to elevate Seagal's image at Chuck's expense, to position Chuck as the outdated relic being graciously educated by the modern expert. "Your techniques," Chuck said, his voice unchanged, "come from years of training?" "Decades," Seagal confirmed, crossing his arms. "Real combat, not sport fighting. And you believe they're superior to what I teach. I believe they're more practical for actual self-defense, yes." Chuck nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you'd like to demonstrate, not on the children, but on someone who can properly evaluate their effectiveness." Seagal's eyes narrowed, trying to gauge whether this was capitulation or challenge. "Are you suggesting—" "A simple demonstration," Chuck interrupted. "You show me these superior techniques. If they're as effective as you claim, I'll absolutely consider incorporating elements into the program. The children's safety is what matters most to me." It was a trap, and both men knew it. But Seagal had painted himself into a corner with his own bravado. To refuse now would be to admit his techniques weren't as superior as he claimed. To accept was to step into an arena with a man who'd been a champion, when Seagal was still learning his first kata. "Fine," Seagal said, rolling his shoulders. "Let's do it. Film everything." He added to his cameraman. "This will be perfect for the documentary, showing the difference between sport martial arts and combat systems." They moved to the main training floor. Seagal, already warming up with elaborate movements, bouncing on his toes, making sure the camera caught every angle. Chuck simply stood in the center of the mat, hands relaxed at his sides, breathing steady. He wasn't angry. Anger had never served him in competition. He was simply present, aware, ready. "Okay," Seagal announced, addressing the camera as much as Chuck. "I'm going to demonstrate a basic wrist lock escape encounter. This is the kind of thing that actually works when someone grabs you on the street, unlike point sparring where you stop at first contact." He moved toward Chuck. "Go ahead, grab my wrists." Chuck complied, his grip firm but not aggressive. What happened next happened fast. Seagal executed his technique. A twist, a rotation, a shift of weight designed to break the grip and position Chuck's arm for a lock. It was textbook Aikido, performed with a theatrical flair Seagal brought to everything. But Chuck's arm didn't lock. His wrist didn't twist. His balance didn't break. Because Chuck had been escaping wrist locks since before Seagal started training. He'd felt the intention in Seagal's movement before it began, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, and neutralized the technique without appearing to move at all. Seagal tried again, adding more force. Again, nothing. Chuck remained rooted, unmoved, his expression unchanged. "You're resisting," Seagal said, irritation creeping into his voice. "I'm standing here," Chuck replied quietly. "In a real situation, your opponent would resist, wouldn't they?" Seagal's jaw tightened. He was used to compliant partners in demonstrations, to students who fell dramatically to showcase his techniques. Facing someone who simply negated his movements through superior positioning and timing was exposing the difference between demonstration and application. "Fine," Seagal snapped. "Let me show you something else. A more advanced technique." He was breathing harder now, ego bruised. This is a shoulder throw combined with... He moved in fast, trying to close distance and establish the grips he needed. But Chuck wasn't there. He'd shifted minimal movement, just enough that Seagal grasped empty air. When Seagal adjusted and tried again, Chuck's hand was suddenly on his shoulder, not striking, not gripping hard, just resting there with the kind of control that made it clear he could have done anything he wanted in that moment. "The problem with complex techniques," Chuck said, his hand remaining on Seagal's shoulder, "is they require your opponent to cooperate. Real self-defense is simpler. It's about position, timing, and understanding movement before it happens." Seagal jerked away, his face reddening. The camera was still recording, capturing everything. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. "You're using sport fighting reflexes," he said, "but it sounded defensive now. What I'm showing is impressive in demonstrations," Chuck finished. "But you asked to show me something that would benefit the children. So far, you've demonstrated techniques. That requires significant strength, perfect timing, and a compliant partner. The kids I teach aren't looking to overpower attackers. They're learning to avoid conflict, to recognize danger, to have confidence without aggression." Seagal's expression darkened. The charitable benefactor persona had evaporated entirely, replaced by raw ego protecting itself. "You know what? I came here to help, to share real knowledge, and you're too stuck in your old ways to recognize it. Those kids are wasting their time learning point sparring nonsense when they could be learning actual combat skills." "Those kids," Chuck said, and for the first time his voice carried heat, "are learning respect, something you might benefit from understanding yourself." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Maria stood frozen in the doorway, hands clasped tight. The cameraman lowered his equipment slightly, sensing he was witnessing something that had gone beyond documentary footage into genuine confrontation. Seagal took a step forward, his voice rising. "You want to talk about respect? I've worked with special forces, law enforcement. I've been in real situations. You've been in choreographed movie fights and point sparring competitions where you stop before making contact. Don't lecture me about." "Then show me." The words were quiet, but they cut through Seagal's tirade like a blade. "What?" Chuck's eyes were steady, unblinking. "You've claimed your techniques are superior. You've dismissed what I teach as inadequate. You've questioned my experience and disrespected the work I do with these children. So show me, demonstrate this superior knowledge. Actually apply one of these techniques you've been talking about." It was the moment Seagal had been maneuvering toward, and simultaneously the last thing he wanted, because talking about combat effectiveness and demonstrating it against a compliant partner was entirely different from facing someone who'd spent decades mastering the art of not being where attacks landed. "I'm not here to fight you," Seagal said, trying to regain the moral high ground. "That's not what this is about." "No," Chuck agreed. "It's about you coming into my facility, disrespecting my students, my teaching, and me, all while filming content to elevate yourself. So either demonstrate that what you claimed is true, or apologize and leave." Seagal's face cycled through emotions: anger, calculation, pride wrestling with self-preservation. He'd built a career on projecting invincibility, on cultivating the image of a deadly martial artist. To walk away now would be to admit that image was just that, an image. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "You want a demonstration? I'll show you what real Aikido looks like when properly applied." He moved in with genuine aggression now, no longer performing for cameras, but trying to prove something to himself. He grabbed for Chuck's wrist, attempting a technique that should have sent Chuck flipping to the mat. Chuck pivoted. Simple, minimal. Seagal stumbled past him, off balance. Seagal spun, embarrassment fueling anger, and tried a more aggressive approach, reaching for a collar grip that would set up a throw. Chuck's hand intercepted the attempt, not blocking but redirecting, turning Seagal's own momentum against him. Seagal found himself moving sideways, his balance compromised, his technique neutralized. "Stop resisting," Seagal barked, as if Chuck was somehow cheating by not cooperating with his own defeat. "This is what resistance looks like," Chuck replied calmly. "This is what a real situation feels like. You can't script it." Something snapped in Seagal then. Pride, ego, the accumulated weight of his constructed image, colliding with reality. He came in hard, abandoning technique for aggression, trying to use size and strength to overwhelm. It was the worst possible choice against someone with Chucknorris' experience. Chuck had spent his entire martial arts career fighting people who were bigger, stronger, more aggressive. He'd learned to make their strength irrelevant through positioning, timing, and understanding that violence always contained its own defeat if you knew where to look. He slipped Seagal's rushing attack, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. One hand guided Seagal's momentum, while the other controlled his balance point. Suddenly, Seagal was moving faster than he intended, in a direction he hadn't chosen, his feet scrambling to keep up with his compromised center of gravity. Chuck could have thrown him, could have taken him down hard to the mat, could have demonstrated the very real gap between Seagal's theatrical aikido and the kind of efficiency that came from decades of actual application. Instead, he simply stopped him, one hand on Seagal's shoulder, the other controlling his arm, holding him in a position where any movement would result in a fall, but remaining stationary was possible if Seagal chose it. "This is the choice I give the children," Chuck said quietly. "Not how to hurt someone, but how to control a situation without ego. How to end conflict without needing victory." Seagal's breathing was ragged, his face flushed with exertion and humiliation. He was trapped, not by superior strength, but by superior understanding. Chuck held him in a position that demonstrated complete control while offering no harm, proving every point Seagal had tried to challenge. "Let go of me," Seagal hissed. Chuck released him immediately, stepping back with his hands open. Seagal stumbled slightly, catching his balance, his expression a mixture of rage and embarrassment. The camera had captured everything, every failed technique, every stumble, every moment where the gap between image and reality had been exposed. "Turn that off." Seagal snapped at his cameraman. "I said turn it off." The young man fumbled with the equipment, stopping the recording. Maria still stood frozen, witnessing the collapse of Seagal's carefully constructed demonstration. "You," Seagal started, pointing at Chuck, his hand shaking slightly. "You set me up. This was a setup." "You set yourself up," Chuck replied, his voice still calm but carrying undeniable weight. "You came here with cameras and ego, wanting to use vulnerable children as props for your image. You disrespected their training, their progress, and the work we do here. You demanded a demonstration, insisted your techniques were superior, and when given the chance to prove it, you failed. That's not a setup. That's consequences." "I wasn't trying," Seagal protested, the excuse sounding hollow even as he said it. "I wasn't using full technique. If this were an actual confrontation," Chuck interrupted, "you'd have been hurt. I gave you every opportunity to succeed with your own methods. You failed because you spent more time building an image than mastering the reality behind it. That's not a criticism, Stephen. That's just truth." Seagal's mouth opened and closed. He looked to his cameraman, to Maria, back to Chuck, searching for something to salvage the situation. But there was nothing. He'd walked in projecting superiority and walked face first into the difference between reputation and skill. "The donation," he finally said, voice tight. "I'm still willing to." "We don't need your money," Chuck said. "What these children need, what anyone learning martial arts needs, is to understand that real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need cameras or demonstrations or proof. It simply is. And the most powerful thing you can do with it is help others without requiring recognition." He gestured to the door. "You should leave now." Seagal stood there for a moment longer, pride and humiliation warring across his features. Then, without another word, he turned and stalked toward the exit, his cameraman and assistant scrambling to follow. At the doorway, he paused, looked back as if to say something final, something to reclaim a shred of dignity. But Chuck's expression stopped him. Not angry, not triumphant, just patient, waiting, offering Seagal the chance to choose grace over ego. Seagal chose silence. The door closed behind him. Maria exhaled, a long breath she'd apparently been holding through the entire confrontation. "Chuck, are you okay?" He nodded, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. "I'm fine, but make a note. No more unscheduled visits, no matter how generous they claim to be." "Already done," she said, then hesitated. "He recorded a lot of that before you told him to stop. What if he uses it anyway? Edits it to make himself look better? Chuck considered this, then shrugged. Then he'll have to live with that choice. I can't control what he does with his footage. I can only control my response to his disrespect, and I'm satisfied with how I handled it. You were amazing, Maria said quietly. The way you just neutralized everything he tried to do. I've had practice, Chuck replied with a slight smile. 50 years of dealing with people who mistake confidence for competence. The technique doesn't change much. Stay centered. Don't engage with ego. Demonstrate truth when necessary. Over the following days, Chuck waited for the documentary footage to appear online, for edited clips showing Seagal in a favorable light to surface on social media. But nothing came. Either Seagal had decided the footage was too damaging to use, or whoever reviewed it convinced him that no amount of editing could transform that confrontation into a victory. What did appear, surprisingly, was a brief mention in a martial arts podcast. One of Seagal's students, apparently present during the filming, had shared the story with colleagues. The version that circulated through martial arts communities was remarkably accurate, describing how Seagal had tried to show up Chucknorris and been quietly, efficiently, undeniably outclassed. Chuck didn't comment on it when reporters reached out. He simply continued his work with the children, teaching them that the strongest people are rarely the loudest, that true mastery doesn't require proof, and that the best victory is often the confrontation you don't need to have. But the incident had changed something in him, or perhaps clarified something that had always been there. For years, he'd absorbed disrespect with patience, understanding that his reputation didn't need defending. He'd let people doubt, mock, challenge, because their opinions didn't change what he knew to be true. Yet watching Seagal try to use vulnerable children as props, to diminish work that was genuinely helping young people find stability and purpose, that had crossed a line Chuck hadn't fully recognized until it was violated. There were things worth defending, even for someone committed to humility. Some disrespect needed to be answered, not for ego's sake, but to protect what mattered. The children in his program never knew the full details of what happened that afternoon. They only knew that Chuck seemed more present in subsequent classes, more emphatic about teaching them that real power was quiet, that genuine skill needed no announcement, and that the people who truly mastered anything spent less time talking about it and more time doing it. One afternoon, a few weeks after the incident, a teenage girl who'd been in the program for 6 months approached Chuck after class. She was one of the success stories, a kid who'd been in constant trouble at school, fighting, suspended multiple times, now carried herself with controlled confidence. "Chuck," she said hesitantly, "someone at school was talking about Steven Seagal. Said he came here." Chuck paused in rolling up the training mats. "He did. Did you really?" She trailed off, unsure how to phrase it. "Did I really what? Did you really beat him up without even trying?" Chuck smiled. "I didn't beat anyone up. He came here wanting to prove something, and I simply showed him that what he was trying to prove wasn't as important as he thought. That's not the same thing." She thought about this. "But you could have, if you wanted to." "Could have, yes. Wanted to, no. There's an important difference there." "Why not? If someone's being disrespectful, why not just show them?" Chuck set down the mat and turned to face her fully. "Because showing someone up, humiliating them, proving you're better, that's about your ego, not about solving the problem. What mattered wasn't demonstrating that I could defeat him. What mattered was protecting this program and what you all are learning here. That required only enough response to stop the disrespect. Nothing more. But don't people need to be taught lessons sometimes?" "They do," Chuck agreed. "But the lesson isn't, 'I'm stronger than you.' The lesson is, your behavior has consequences, and those consequences don't require me to become cruel or aggressive. That's the lesson I hope Mr. Seagal learned. Not that I could beat him. He probably knew that already. But that real strength is knowing when to use your skills, and more importantly, when not to." She nodded slowly, processing. "Is that why you teach us to walk away from fights when we can?" "Exactly. Walking away isn't weakness. It's strength under control. But he paused, making sure she understood. If you can't walk away, if the situation requires you to act, then you act decisively, efficiently, and only as much as necessary, not to prove anything, but to resolve the situation, like you did with him. Like I did with him, Chuck confirmed. She grinned. I wish I could have seen it. No, Chuck said gently. You witnessed something better. You saw that even people who seem important and successful can still be insecure and wrong. You learned that reputation doesn't equal character. And you saw that standing up for what's right doesn't require violence or cruelty. It just requires clarity and conviction. The conversation stayed with him as he locked up the facility that evening. He thought about all the confrontations he'd avoided over the years, all the challenges he deflected with humor or humility. He thought about the line between patience and enabling, between confidence and arrogance, between necessary action and unnecessary violence. He'd spent his life trying to embody the principles he'd learned through martial arts: discipline, respect, humility, the understanding that the most powerful person in any room was often the quietest. But he'd also learned that those principles didn't mean accepting disrespect or allowing others to harm what you'd built. The balance was delicate. Too far one way and you became arrogant, picking fights to prove yourself. Too far the other way and your humility became permission for others to abuse it. The path between required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant awareness of intention. Seagal had come looking for validation, for content, for a demonstration that would elevate his image. What he'd found instead was a mirror reflecting the gap between the person he pretended to be and the person he actually was. Chuck hadn't put that gap there. He'd simply refused to pretend it didn't exist. Months later, Chuck received a letter. No return address, but the handwriting was distinctive, bold, aggressive strokes, the physical embodiment of Seagal's personality. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was a rambling explanation of intention, a defense of methods, a justification of approach. But buried in the third paragraph was a single sentence that Chuck read twice. Perhaps I misjudged the situation and came on stronger than necessary. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement Seagal could probably manage. Chuck didn't respond. The letter wasn't about opening dialogue. It was about Seagal processing what happened, trying to reconcile his self-image with the reality of that afternoon. Chuck filed the letter away and never mentioned it to anyone, because that was the other part of real strength, knowing when to claim victory and when to simply allow someone their dignity in defeat. The program continued to grow. More children enrolled. More lives changed. Chuck kept teaching the same principles he'd always taught: discipline, respect, control, the understanding that power was responsibility, not privilege. He never mentioned the Seagal incident in his classes, never used it as a teaching example. But the students who'd been there that day, who'd seen Chuck quietly, efficiently handle disrespect without cruelty, carried that lesson forward. They understood in a way no lecture could teach them that real strength was quiet, that genuine skill needed no announcement, and that the most devastating response to arrogance was often simple truth. Years from now, when those children were adults, they'd remember that afternoon differently than Chuck did. They'd remember a showdown, a confrontation, maybe even exaggerate the physical aspects of it. But beneath the embellishment, they'd carry the real lesson: that the strongest people are often the quietest, that genuine mastery speaks through action, not proclamation, and that defending what matters doesn't require you to destroy what threatens it. Chuck thought about this as he watched his students execute their techniques with improving precision. He thought about all the Steven Seagals of the world, the people who built images instead of substance, who confused volume for authority, who measured worth through comparisons instead of contributions. And he felt grateful that his own path had taught him different lessons, that decades of training, competing, teaching, and simply living had shown him that the goal wasn't to be the strongest person in the room. It was to help everyone in the room become stronger. That reputation was what others said about you, but character was what you did when no one was watching. That real power was knowing you could act and choosing when not to. The sun set through facility windows, painting everything in gold. Chuck watched his students bow, thank each other, begin the process of transformation back from disciplined martial artists to regular kids with homework and chores and normal lives. This was the work that mattered. Not confrontations with aging action stars, not defending his reputation, not proving he could still move like he did 40 years ago. This was legacy. These children learning to carry themselves with confidence without arrogance, learning to defend themselves without becoming aggressive, learning that the strongest people are often the kindest because they have nothing to prove. Steven Seagal had come to his facility that day looking for validation. What he'd found instead was a lesson about the difference between image and substance, between projected power and genuine skill, between reputation and character. Chuck hoped he'd learn from it. But either way, the lesson was taught, and the children who witnessed it, who saw respect defended without cruelty, who learned that real strength was quiet and controlled and decisive only when necessary. They'd carry that forward in ways that mattered far more than any documentary footage or social media moment. Because that was the truth Seagal never understood. Your legacy isn't built in confrontations or demonstrations. It's built in the quiet moments, the consistent work, the lives you touch without needing credit for touching them. Chuck locked up the facility, the familiar sounds and smells bringing their usual comfort. Tomorrow there would be another class, more children learning discipline and respect. There would be more challenges, more tests of patience, more opportunities to choose between ego and principle. And he'd face them the same way he'd faced that humid afternoon with Steven Seagal, with quiet confidence, controlled power, and the understanding that real strength never needs to announce itself. It simply is. And when forced to demonstrate itself, it does so efficiently, necessarily, and without cruelty. That's the lesson worth teaching. That's the legacy worth building. And that's the truth no amount of Hollywood posturing can ever change. Kindness is not weakness. Humility is not surrender. And the people who truly master anything spend less time proving it and more time sharing it with those who need it most.